What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Magicka Sorcerer. Specifically, we're going to be talking about using a non-pet build. Now, unlike previous patches, non-pet builds are now pulling less DPS overall compared to pet builds, and that's mainly because of the changes that were made to pet damage from the transition from Murkmire to Wrathstone. So the basic attacks for pet damage now scales off of your buffs, your CPs, everything like that. Currently it didn't really scale like that, which gave the Twilight Tormentor, the Twilight Pet in general, a very large buff overall. So right now, pet sorcs are pulling ahead of non-pet sorcs when it comes to pure DPS. That being said, there are a few drawbacks of running pet sorcs, so that's just something you want to keep in mind here. So it's always nice to have this non-pet backup, just in case your raid lead, for example, says, I don't want any pets in this particular trial, I don't want any pets in this particular run. That's just nice to have that sort of backup option. There's also the chance, of course, that the pet might end up being nerfed a little bit, because in my opinion it is overperforming a little bit, so you still want to have that non-pet build to sort of fall back on, just in case something happens where you can't use your pet build that anymore for whatever reason. So, just like the rest of our build videos, we'll be going over gear, skills, attributes, everything you need to know to basically recreate this build yourself. We will be talking about a couple of gear substitutions when we go over the gear, in case you might not have certain DLCs or expansions. We'll talk about our rotation a little bit, and then we'll go over a 6-man dummy parse so you guys can get an idea of the amount of DPS that a Magicka Sorcerer is able to pull on a non-pet build. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here first with our gear. So, gear between Murkmire and Wrathstone has not changed at all. There were no new sets that were introduced in the Wrathstone dungeons that really sort of supplanted Siroria, Spell Strategist, or any other sort of sets here. There is one set that has been added in as a potential option as a front bar set, mainly due to the buffs that were made with the Shadow Mundus in Wrathstone. So, for Monster Helm set, we're running a Zaan. Zaan is still the strongest Monster Helm set in the game right now for Magicka DPS. It does require you to be within melee range, so you have to be within 8 meters in order to get it to proc. So that's just something you want to keep in mind. If you can't play within that 8-meter radius, then you will need to use a different Monster Helm set. Now, Zaan is a DLC set, so you must get this from Scalecaller Peak, so you need to have access to Dragonbones DLC in order to use Zaan's. Now, if you do not have access to the Dragonbones DLC, you do have a few other options when it comes to Monster Helm sets. The first set that I'm going to be talking about here is going to be Ilambris. Ilambris has very good synergy with Magicka Sorcerers, unlike with other Magicka DPS, and that's mainly because Sorcerer's main class dot, Liquid Lightning, counts as shock damage. So you're able to get very reliable procs on both the flame and the shock component of Ilambris, basically giving it a step up compared to Skoria, which is the other very common ranged Magicka DPS helm. So that being said, the Ilambris does have a little bit of a weakness, and that's the fact that the procs themselves, they last for 5 seconds, but they only affect the area under which it procced. So if the boss happens to move out of your proc, then you will not be able to do any damage because the proc was not going to be hitting the boss anymore. So for more mobile fights, Skoria might still end up doing more DPS just because Skoria does all of its damage in one blow, compared to Ilambris, where you have to make sure that the boss stays in that proc for 5 seconds to get the most out of your Ilambris procs. But if you can keep the boss there, Ilambris does do more DPS than Skoria. Skoria is, let me see if I can find it. Knock on Skoria here. There's another base game set, so you can get this from City of Ash 2. So again, it's very similar to Ilambris, where it is a ranged DPS set, but unlike Ilambris, it deals all of its damage in one hit, so it is going to be more reliable for those more mobile bosses that are moving around a lot. If you're able to play within melee range, instead of running Ilambris or Skoria, you can run Grothar instead. So Grothar is another base game Monster Helm set from Vault of Madness. This is the strongest Monster Helm set in the game if you're able to be within melee range and you don't have access to any of the DLC. So the strongest base game Monster Helm set is going to be Grothar for Magicka DPS. But very similar to Zaan, you have to be within 8 meters in order to make the most use out of it. Unlike Zaan though, Grothar does have a cleave component behind it, so in trash pulls, Grothar is probably going to be a little bit stronger than Zaan because of that additional cleave. It's probably going to be up there with Ilambris as well, because Ilambris also does have a small cleave component associated with it. Now for our other sets here. So our first set is going to be Siroria, again unchanged between Murkmire and Wrathstone here. Siroria is still going to be the strongest, one of the strongest sets for Magicka DPS in the game right now. So this does come from Cloudrest, so you do need to have access to the Somerset expansion in order to get this set here. I had the perfected version here, which comes from Vet Cloudrest. The armor comes from +1, the jewelry comes from +2 and +3. So if you can't clear Vet Cloud Rest +1 or above, then you can go with the imperfect version, which drops from normal Cloud Rest. So the difference between the two of them is that 1096 additional Max Magicka, which is pretty small overall in terms of DPS bonus. It's really only about 1% of DPS at most, so don't really worry too much about having to run the imperfect version compared to the perfect version here. You want to try to make sure Siroria is your body set, just because of that 2 additional Max Magicka bonuses. If it's on your front bar set, then you will end up losing that Max Magicka bonus while you're on your back bar, and that's not really going to be ideal for you there. Now, if you don't have access to the Cloud Rest expansion, you do have a few other options when it comes to body sets. So one of the biggest ones, you need to pop open Craft Store for this. It's a very easy set to obtain. It's a craftable set. It's going to be, find it, Julianos. So Julianos is a crafted set from Hrothgar, so you do need to have access to the Hrothgar DLC in order to craft this. But because it is a crafted set, you can pay somebody else to craft the set for you, if they have access to Hrothgar, of course, or you can buy these pieces off of the guild traders. So Julianos is a very solid set. It's not going to be the best set in the game, but if you're just starting to farm your other sets, for instance, Julianos is a great set to kind of get yourself started. This is going to be a body set just because that 5-piece is a static bonus, the 299 additional spell damage. So just bear that in mind. You don't really want to have Julianos, you don't really want to run that as a front bar set at all. Another set you might want to consider picking up as a potential front bar set, or body set I should say, I don't have it out here, and it is going to be Mother's Sorrow. So Mother's Sorrow isn't going to be quite as strong on a Magicka Sorc compared to on a Magicka Templar or Magicka Nightblade, because Sorcs don't have 10% additional crit damage on any of their passives. But the spell crit that Mother's Sorrow provides is still a very strong bonus overall. It is a little bit stronger than what Julianos is able to provide for you. This is a light armor set that is dropped from Deshawn, so you can buy it off of Guild Trader. You can farm this yourself. So very solid set to pick up. Generally speaking, I'd probably say go with Julianos instead of Mother Sorrow, so that way you don't necessarily have to spend all that money. As long as you get the materials, you can usually pay somebody a small sort of crafter's fee in order to craft Julianos for you, and the DPS difference between Mother Sorrow and Julianos is overall pretty small. So in my opinion, it's not really worth kind of paying for Mother Sorrow or farming Mother Sorrow when you can just pay, get some materials together and get somebody to craft you Julianos instead. So those are a few options for your front bars, your body set, if you don't really have access to the Somerset expansion to get Siroria. Now for our front bar set, we're running Spell Strategist. Spell Strategist is still, again, one of the strongest sets in the game for Magicka DPS. Hasn't been changed between Murkmire and Wrathstone. This is a PvP set, so you do get this set from the rewards from the worthy coffers that you get for every 20k AP that you obtain. So you can get it that way, just naturally, just through PvPing, through Cyrodiil or Battlegrounds, or you can buy this off of guild traders instead. So this is a front bar set because that 5-piece sort of proc does carry over to the back bar, so if you procs on the front bar, it carries over to your back bar and it lasts for 5 seconds. And as I'm going to be talking about later on in the video, we are doing a dynamic rotation, so we're actually going to be on our front bar for a pretty decent amount of time overall. So Spell Strategist is definitely a very strong front bar set. There are 2 other sets that you might want to consider instead of this set if you need to take some time in order to gain this set. So the first set is Mechanical Acuity. So this is making a comeback mainly because of the buffs that were made to the Shadow Mundus. So the Shadow Mundus was 9% on Murkmire, but now on Wrathstone it is a 13% base increase to your crit damage, which kind of brought Acuity up as a potential set again for Magicka DPS. This is a crafted set from Clockwork City, so very similar to the Julianos set that we talked about earlier. You can craft this yourself, you can pay somebody else to craft it for you, or you can just buy this straight off of guild traders. It's like Julianos, is a 6 trait set, so you do need to know 6 traits if you want to craft this yourself. So Mechanical Acuity, this 5-piece basically gives you 100% chance to crit for 5 seconds every 18 seconds whenever you deal direct damage. So really strong set, especially when you compare it with Shadow. So if you're running this set, you pretty much have to pair this with the Shadow, just because you running the Thief isn't really going to be all too beneficial to you. So this is a very strong set to have as a front bar set. It actually, in longer fights, the average DPS actually works out to be just a little bit under Spell Strategist. They're very similar in terms of DPS potential, and in shorter fights, the additional burst that you get from Mechanical Acuity can push it ahead of Spell Strategist in certain shorter fights. So that's one of the front bar sets that you might want to consider running. The other one is going to be, I don't have it here. The other one is going to be Burning Spellweave. It's going to be all the way up here. Oh wait, no. Do I already have it? I think I already have it out. So Burning Spellweave. Here it is, Burning Spellweave. So this is a drop set from City of Ash, so you need to run it through City of Ash in order to get these sets. But whenever you deal flame damage, you basically have a chance to apply the burning stats effect and increase your spell damage by 525 when it's completely rolled out for 8 seconds. So sorcs do have a fair decent amount of flame damage. You have Blockade and you have your light attacks. So Burning Spellweave, you probably won't get as much uptime compared to like on a Magicka DK that pretty much specializes only in flame damage, but you can still get pretty good uptime with Burning Spellweave. Anywhere between 55 to 60% uptime is what I commonly see whenever I parse using Burning Spellweave. So very similar to Spell Strategist, that this is a proc set, so it will carry over to your back bar. So a good set to have on hand. Used to be the meta quite a few patches ago, and it's still a very strong set today. Not quite as strong as Mechanical Acuity or Spell Strategist, but you still want to try to hold on to this set if you have it. Or if you have it, just in case there are nerfs that might come to the sets, or this set might see a buff. So it is a good idea to hold on to Burning Spellweave. Then for our back bar, we're still running the Maelstrom Inferno staff. We still want to have that Blockade of Fire for the additional damage that it deals to burning enemies. Now for armor traits, jewelry traits, enchants, things like that. So for our armor, we're going all max Magicka enchants, and we have all divines. You can go with Infused on your large pieces if you would like. The DPS difference between the two is going to be very, very small. We're talking probably a 1/10 of a percentage point at most. So it's really going to be boiled down to which trait did you happen to get first for your chest, legs, and head. If you happen to get Infused first, you can run that. If you happen to get Divines first, you can run that as well. For our jewelry, we're going with 3 Bloodthirsty and all spell damage enchants. Now, sorcs do have that reputation of having really, really bad sustain. Your drain versus your regen is going to be, the gap there is quite large. So if you feel like you need to sustain, you can, if you really need to, put a Magicka regen glyph on one of your jewelry pieces if you want. Personally, I probably wouldn't do that. I'd probably say run balance before you actually start running a Magicka regen glyph, but that it is an option if you feel like you need additional regen here. We're going with Bloodthirsty because it is a very powerful jewelry trait. It's probably the strongest, typically speaking, for all Magicka DPS and Stamina DPS as well. If you don't want to run Bloodthirsty though, because there are going to be some fights where you don't want Bloodthirsty, or Bloodthirsty is going to be a little bit less effective. For example, in Cloud Rest, in that instances, you're going to want to run Infused instead. Infused is another very strong trait here, just because of the changes that were made to how CP were calculated. Infused does give you, generally speaking, more spell damage than the Arcane jewelry trait does. That being said, the Arcane jewelry trait, the difference between Arcane and Infused is going to be pretty small, and generally speaking, Arcane will give you a little bit better sustain because you do have larger max Magicka pulls that way. For weapons, Infused front bar with the flame damage enchant, there is an argument for running Precise, but the mathematics behind that are a little bit tricky. Basically, you have to do above a certain amount of DPS in order for Precise to actually be stronger than Infused. So Infused is going to be a little bit more consistent that way. And for your back bar, also Infused to absorb Magicka enchant. Again, sustain is really bad on a Magicka sorc, so you're going to want to run that absorb Magicka enchant there. If you're in a good group, you might be able to sustain with a shock damage enchant if you're running something like spell symmetry / balance. But generally speaking, I'd probably just stick with an absorb Magicka enchant unless you're certain that you're able to sustain like a shock glyph on the back bar, for example. Now going over to our character sheet, I am a Breton here. So Bretons get 2000 max Magicka, 100 Magicka regen, and 7% cost reduction to all their Magicka abilities. So very, very powerful sustain class. Combine that with the sorc's really crap regen versus drain per second disparity, and Bretons are actually a very good option for sorcs for that additional sustain. There are 2 other races that are going to be stronger than Bretons, assuming that you're able to sustain the rotation. That's kind of a big assumption there. It's going to be the High Elves and the Dark Elves. The High Elves also get 2000 max Magicka, but they don't get any sort of additional regen passive. Magicka regen passive, I should say. They do get 258 spell damage though, so they get more raw damage, but they lose out on the sustain. Dark Elves get 1875 max Magicka and 258 spell damage, so very similar to Altmer. They get pretty much raw damage, but no regen to speak of. Now, if for whatever reason you also want to play a Stamp Sorc later on down the line, then I would recommend going with Dark Elf, because Dark Elves also get 875 max stamina and 258 weapon damage as well. So if you do want to sort of flip-flop between Magicka and Stamina DPS, Dark Elves are probably the best way to go. One other race you might want to consider running is going to be the Khajiits. They get 10% additional crit damage, as well as 825 health, Magicka, and stamina, and they get 85 Magicka and stamina regen and 100 health regen. 10% additional crit damage is a little bit helpful there. It's going to be less of a bonus compared to the 258 spell damage that you get, and Khajiits also have lower resource return in terms of that regen per second, as well as lower overall max resources. That being said, though, they also get 10% additional crit healing done, so if you also want to sort of play an off DPS healer spec, Khajiits are also not a bad option when it comes to race for a Magicka Sorcerer. For attributes, all points into max Magicka here. Not a surprise, you want to maximize your DPS. If you do need some additional survivability, by all means you can put a few points into health. I personally would not recommend putting more than 10 points into health though, because at that point you're kind of giving up a little bit too much max Magicka, giving up a little bit too much damage there. For our Mundus, we are going with the Shadow. You can go with the Thief instead. It's really up to you which one you want to go for. The DPS difference between the two of them is going to be pretty small. Generally speaking, the higher your crit chance, the stronger the Shadow becomes. The lower your crit chance, the stronger the Thief becomes. If you're not running Mother's Sorrow, typically speaking, the Thief will inch out a little bit ahead of the Shadow. If you are running Mother's Sorrow or Mechanical Acuity, then the Shadow is going to win out instead. But like I said earlier, the DPS difference between the two of them is going to be pretty small overall. I'm a werewolf. I should be a vampire, but I was testing out a werewolf build earlier on this build as a sorcerer, so that's why I'm a werewolf. You should be a vampire for the 10% additional Magicka regen, though. Unfortunately, because I decided to test out werewolf, I cannot untransform into a vampire, so I'm stuck with the werewolf as is. But you should be a vampire for the 10% additional Magicka regen. Every little bit of regen does help on a sorcerer. And then for our food, for the purposes of the parse, I am using parse foods. This is Ghastly Eyeball. This basically imitates getting orbs on cooldown. That additional Magicka regen is pretty close to what you would get from orbs if you were getting orbs on cooldown. The max Magicka is a little bit lower than the blue food, so this is a good kind of approximation of running blue food using orbs on cooldown. In an actual raid, you should be running Witchmother's Potent Brew or Clockwork Citrus Fillet instead. That way you get the max health, you get a little bit max Magicka, and you get some additional Magicka regen. So that way you get the regen from the food as well as the orb sustain, in which case your sustain does end up improving quite a bit there. And it's very, very important for, Magicka Sorc especially to get that additional sustain. So I would not run parse food in an actual raid. I would be running something like Witchmother's or Clockwork Citrus Fillet instead. Now going over our skill bars. For our front bar, we have Crystal Frags, Elemental Weapon, Haunting Curse, Endless Fury, Bound Aegis, and Greater Storm Atronach. And for our back bar, Liquid Lightning, Blockade of Fire. This is where you would put your shield, so you would be running Empowered Ward or Hardened Ward. Doesn't really matter which one you pick. I personally prefer Empowered Ward for the minor intellect buff to both yourself and everybody else around you. But for the purposes of the parse, we're using Ellie Drain. Then we have Rearming Trap here. You need to be within melee range to use Rearming Trap, so if you aren't within melee range, then you can run Challenge Acceleration instead. Bound Aegis again, and then Greater Storm Atronach again. So that is all of our bars here. So if you don't have Elemental Weapon, you can use Force Pulse instead from the Destro Staff line here, so you can run Force Pulse. Force Pulse is going to be a little bit harder to sustain, because you can see here the cost is a little bit higher. The damage is pretty comparable overall, but it's just going to be a little bit harder to sustain running Force Pulse compared to running Elemental Weapon instead. Now for our champion points, the CP cap is now 810, so it hasn't changed at all between Wrathstone and Murkmire, so it's still 810, gives us 270 points to put across each of our different constellation nodes here. Starting off with our green CPs, you have 75 in Arcanist, 75 in Tenacity. That leaves us 120 points to put into the remaining nodes, however you really like. The 40 Shadow Ward, 40 Tumbling, 40 Warlord is what I have. You can push Arcanist and Tenacity all the way up to 15%, so that's basically just dumping 100 points into both of them. If you do that, you have 70 points instead to play around with rather than 120. For our blue CPs, I have 72 into Elfborn, 64 into Ellie Expert, 25 into Spell Erosion, 66 Master at Arms, 9 Staff Expert, and 34 into Thaumaturge. And finally, for our red CPs, this particular setup I have is kind of a generic setup. It's going to give you very good mitigation across all pieces of conduct that you might want to run, but it will not maximize your mitigation. So if you want to run, for example, Maw of Lorcage, you're going to want to shift some red points around because you want to maximize your mitigation against spell damage compared to kind of taking a more balanced approach. 81 Ironclad, 61 Thick-Skinned, and 64 into both Hardy and Elemental Defender. So that is pretty much it for the build information, so now let's go ahead and talk about our rotation. So most Magicka DPS, if not all Magicka DPS, are running a dynamic rotation right now. What that basically means is you want to maximize the uptime on all of your dots. So our dots do have varying durations. So Liquid Lightning is 10 seconds, Blockade is 8 seconds. Haunting Curse, you can treat this as a 12-second duration because the first one goes off at 3.5 seconds and the second one happens after 8.5 seconds after that. So you can treat it as a 12-second dot that way. So that's just kind of how it all plays out. So you do have varying durations on your dots and you want to maximize the duration of your dots. This basically maximizes the DPS potential of your dots as well as minimize the amount of extra magicka that you're using. So if you're recasting, for example, Liquid Lightning 2 or 3 seconds before it is actually up on like a static rotation or something, you're giving up a little bit of DPS because you're not letting the dot run its full duration, plus you're using up more magicka than you have to, again, because you're recasting it a little bit early that way. So dynamic rotation will give you a little bit more DPS, even though it is a little bit harder to learn and you need to be a lot more aware of where you are in your rotation. You need to be a lot more aware of the duration that's remaining on your dots. A few things to keep in mind if you are a sorcerer. The Haunting Curse, you need to make sure that second explosion goes off. So you need to let Haunting Curse go for the full 12 seconds. So if it goes off after the second time, you want to reapply it right away if you can. But if you're kind of caught in your back bar trying to reapply Blockade or Liquid Lightning, do that first and then hit Haunting Curse instead. The other thing is Crystal Frags. So Crystal Frags will proc every time you use any other sort of Magicka ability, and when it does proc, your frag basically does more damage. It's an instant cast, and it costs less Magicka to use. So you want to use the proc as soon as it pops up. So sometimes you get the proc off, like you get the proc and then in the middle of a bar swap, so you use your ability, get the proc, and you bar swap to reapply your dots. In that instance, don't go back to your front bar to get the proc off, just finish off your dots on the back bar and then get the proc off as soon as you go back to your front bar here. But you want to make sure to get this proc pretty much off right away, and the idea behind this is, one, it's good for your sustain because it costs less Magicka in order to use, so 50% less Magicka here would be about 1600 Magicka, so it's the cheapest ability out of pretty much all of your abilities here. So it helps let your sustain that way. The other thing too is that while you have that proc, you can't get a second proc, so you can't sort of store your procs. So if you happen to get a proc off and you don't end up using it, and you get another proc to go off, you basically wasted your first proc, because the second proc will basically override that first proc. You can't have two or more procs sort of stored up, so to speak, with Crystal Frags. That's why you want to use it right away. So here's a quick demonstration of what I mean by a sort of dynamic rotation here. So make sure you want to get that Crystal Frag proc right away. So very similar to the Nightblade, you'll be bar swapping a little bit more often here in order to maximize your dot duration. You can see here I am using Action Duration Reminder to basically help me keep track of my dots. That's what I mean with a more dynamic rotation. Now, a more static rotation basically involves every time you're on your back bar, I'll just let the dots run out so I can kind of show you what I mean. A dynamic rotation basically means we're going to always use the same back bar rotation. So we're going to let Liquid Lightning overcast it a little bit here. So a more static rotation will look something like this. Blockade's about to run out, so we go back to our back bar and we apply Liquid Lightning. So the static rotation is going to be a little bit easier to maintain, because instead of having to keep track of two dots separately, you just have to combine them together there. And you just reapply Haunting Curse whenever you happen to be back on your front bar here. That's kind of just the general idea of a static rotation. And again, it does deal less damage overall compared to a dynamic rotation because you are overcasting your dots by a little bit there. Now when you get into execute, so execute range for sorcs is going to be 20%. At that point you are going to obviously drop Elemental Weapon and use Endless Fury instead. You still want to use Crystal Frags, but you're not going to want to use them all too often. just because Endless Fury will do a little bit more damage. You still want to use Crystal Frags though, mainly because of the passive under the Dark Magic skill line, Exploitation, so you still want to get that Minor Prophecy out. So at the very least you should be using them every 20 seconds, but I would still recommend trying to get every single proc off when you can during Execute. Again, it does cost less than running Endless Fury, and while Endless Fury might deal a little bit more damage, Crystal Frags deals almost as much damage, so it's nice to be able to get Crystal Frags off there. So it helps out your sustain. It still deals very good damage. And it also continues to proc Exploitation. So we're going to go ahead and do a 6-minute dummy parse so you guys get an idea of the DPS that we're able to pull here. Now, one thing that I will mention here is that if you want to compare this to something like a Magicka Nightblade or a Magicka Warden, those two classes do have Minor Berserk built in, so you just want to keep that in mind. You will want to compare this parse to other Magicka DPS parses, and again, these are solo parses, so we're not really getting any raid buffs. These are not going to be really translatable to actual in-raid performance. Just something you want to keep in mind here. So let's go ahead and get started here with our parse. So I like to use the Storm Atronach on the back bar and sort of bar swap cancel out of the animation. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. That's just something I prefer to do. Now there is some RNG involved with a sorc parse just because of the RNG nature of Crystal Frags. You can see here, for example, I've got all of 2 Crystal Frag procs so far, 3. And so there is a little bit of an RNG nature with the Crystal Frag procs. Sometimes you'll get them every single time you cast an ability, like here, but sometimes you will not have that luxury. Again, I like to animation cancel out of the cast time if I can. I always try to, but sometimes depending on where my dot timers lie, it's kind of impossible for me to do that. Do keep in mind that part of the reason why our sustain is this good is because we are on a Bren. So if you are running like a high elf or a dark elf, your sustain is not going to be nearly as good as what you're seeing right now. So we're in a 20% range, so we're going to swap to using Endless Fury instead. Drop Ellie Weapon altogether. We're also going to drop Haunting Curse. We're still going to be using Crystal Frags when they proc, if they proc. And there we go, that is the non-pet sorc parse here. So we pulled around 49.2k, and again there is a lot of RNG involved when it comes to mag sorc parses, especially non-heavy attack parses where we're using Crystal Frags because of the RNG nature of Crystal Frags. So we got 15 Crystal Frag procs here. We got really bad crit RNG actually with this. We only got 27% of our Crystal Frags actually crit. So that's just something you also want to kind of examine when you're looking over your parse. Sometimes you get really bad RNG with certain hits. So for example, Crystal Frags got really bad RNG here, but we got really good RNG with the Haunting Curse in terms of crit RNG. So that's Crystal Frags is pretty strong. So if we want to take a look at the max hits, Crystal Frags does have a higher max hit than Endless Fury, even though Endless Fury does have a higher average. So that's why you still want to use Crystal Frags and execute when you can. That max hit is going to be higher than Endless Fury, even though Endless Fury does end up doing more DPS on average. So that's something you want to keep in mind there. And then definitely want to use Storm Atronach as much as you can. Now there are going to be instances where you're going to want to use the Desher ulti instead, in which case you would replace one of your 2 Storm Atronach with the Desher ulti. I'd recommend swapping out the back bar because you still want the 2% spell damage from Expert Mage on the front bar there. So for cleave situations, by all means continue to use the Desher ulti, but for single target DPS you definitely want to use the Storm Atronach. Not only does it do more single target DPS than the Desher ulti, if somebody activates the synergy on it, it gives them Major Berserk and it gives the HO Major Berserk as well. So it just helps out your group DPS a little bit if you do use the Storm Atronach synergy instead. So that's pretty much it for this build video. Hopefully you guys found this informative. If you guys have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. Again, hope you guys found this video informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.